speakers, it's sort of a perfect threesome since they walk their lives together. Our first speaker is Rick Hill Sr. Rick is a member of the Diva clan of the Tuscarora Nation of the Haudenosaunee on 6 nations of the Grand River Territory. He's an esteemed knowledge keeper, an artist and curator, a writer, a cultural historian with expertise in a whole pile of areas, including Haudenosaunee law and wampum diplomacy. He's a beloved teacher, renowned lecturer, and speaker. Rick currently serves as Senior Project Coordinator for the Deugahoge Indigenous Knowledge Center at the Six Nations Polytechnic in Ohsweken. Rick sums up his work over many decades of preserving, recovering, and repatriating and sharing Indigenous knowledges as coming down to a simple but really powerful goal, and that is to help people in the ship do less harm to people of the canoe, and to help the people of the canoe counteract the legacy of colonialism. Chandra Maracle is the mother of 4 daughters, which is a source of wisdom I really just bow down to. An educator, a community health researcher and scholar, a nutritionist and natural health practitioner, a committed community worker who, in her own words, at any given moment is thinking about, talking about, preparing, or eating food. Chandra was born to a Sicilian mother and a Mohawk father and raised in Haudenosaunee territory in Buffalo, New York, and she currently lives on 6 nations of the Grand River Territory. Chandra is founder and nutrition coordinator for the Everlasting Tree School at 6 Nations, and is founder of the Guelph, Real People Eat Real Food, which explores links between food, people, language, and land. Please help me welcome Rick and Chandra.
There's a power cord on the floor. It might be in your way.
Volado ang sewaguego. Ikiplay here on the Palanigawan again, it can all insula. Ayamos G. Guego Scona Nise, Guego Scona Sawanadanya. Ayamos G. Sewida Kalide, that can say what Wajale Oni. Ayamos G. Sewida Kalide, Daphno. On the gadi scat igula, dewado, de tinufalado.
Anna, pull that speaker away. Yeah.
Okay. Lock that door. So welcome everyone on behalf of my family. I'd like to thank you for having us here today and welcoming us so warmly. I wanted to offer some words of greetings and thanksgiving in Haga, the Mohawk language, one of the 6 nations, one of the 6 languages which can be found spoken at 6 Nations territory. I mentioned that I hope that you were all well and healthy, that your families were well and healthy, and also that you were peaceful and content in your mind, and that I was very pleased to be here, and that all of us are here together this evening to share this knowledge and information from Yawa. So they tell me a long, long time ago, a really, really long time ago, in fact the beginning of time here on the earth as we know it, that there was a woman who fell from the sky, and this woman was pregnant, and when she arrived here on this land with the help of some birds who helped her to land on the back of a turtle, also assisted by some animals, and she gave birth to a daughter. And after a long series of events, that daughter gave birth to 2 twin boys. In so doing, she was killed, and where her body was placed grew several things from her body in that first grave. And we know for sure that those were the Diohequan, sometimes known as the 3 sisters, the corn, the beans, and the squash. Some say that there were some purple potatoes in there or some Jerusalem artichokes and also some tobacco. But either way, one thing we know for sure is that that first grade then is why we become to call in Ganyak Gehaga, or in the Mohawk language, the earth, she to us is mother. She is our mother, the earth. So it is in the language there to be able to say that. It's not just something that came out of Woodstock in the 60s. It actually is our mother, the earth, when we refer to her in the language. So at that point in time, right at the beginning of time, we establish a relationship to food that is inextricable to the culture and that has lasted all the way to this day. One really good example of that is, did anybody here, hopefully many of you got a sample of the cornbread that we brought? Okay. So that cornbread is likely made from this here, which my husband will talk about some more later. This is a traditional white corn amongst the Haudenosaunee. And that's what it's a bread corn or flour corn that cornbread was made from. So we know that this corn has its origins, some say in the Sky World before Sky Woman came, but certainly we know that right at that beginning of time here on Earth, from Sky Woman's daughter, that right there establishes that long, deep, rich, and wonderful history of a relationship to food for the Haudenosaunee. Okay. So I was thinking a lot on the way here about this notion of decolonizing our diet. I said to Rick, so what am I supposed to talk about tonight? So, well, you know, decolonizing our diets. And we talk about this a lot, certainly in education, this whole notion of decolonizing and dismantling and unraveling colonizing systems that have happened globally for centuries and centuries. But when it comes to diet, I take a little bit of a different strategy. And I've often been known to say that my table is my strategy. And today I'd like to say that there are many tables here that is our strategy. There's another metaphor in Haudenosaunee culture that when we lived in longhouse villages, that there would be a metaphor called extending the rafters. And what that would mean is that the houses, the long houses, were open-ended so that the rafters could be extended and the house could be made longer and longer to invite more and more family members in. So I like to think that at my house, that's my strategy. Instead of extending the rafters of my home, I like to extend the leaps in my table so that I can have more people around. Because I believe that when we sit around in situations like this, where we share really, really good food, and there was some really great food on that table there tonight, that's a much better strategy for talking about some really sticky subjects. So if we got together and we were just in a big empty room and didn't have really great food with us, the conversation, I believe, wouldn't go quite as well. And we're talking about really tough subjects like residential schools, for example. But we know that when we sit around with friends, and friends immediately become family when you sit around my table with some really good food, that it makes it a little bit easier to have some of these tough conversations. We're going to talk about education in just a little while when we talk about our school. But in terms of decolonizing, I like to add on another word, and I like to call it rehumanizing. Yeah, we're looking to unravel some systems for sure. We're looking to acknowledge some things that have happened over several centuries which have devastated communities for sure. But one of the strategies to get back to this knowledge is about rehumanizing. So in that time of the creation story, some original instructions were sent out, something we call ungwe neha, kind of just people doing people things in people ways, depending wherever you are on the planet. So in a Ganyak way or Haudenosaunee way, it would be ungwe neha, ways of knowing amongst the Haudenosaunee people. So when we get back to rehumanizing our diet, then we think about diet as a whole and nutrition as a whole lot more than just the content of the food on your plate. There's a whole lot that goes into nutrition. There's a whole lot that goes into eating other than just the nutritional breakdown of the food on your plate. How are we eating together? Who are you eating with? Are you eating quickly or are you eating slowly? What informed the choice that you made? Did you grab a bagel or a donut and a coffee this morning? Or did you have a bowl of corn mush made from this right here? There's a whole lot of factors that go into the choices that we make. And sometimes we don't feel like they're really our choices, But when we come together in community, I find that we can really raise the bar. Because when we do things in community, and we're all pitching in, we're all doing things together, we can raise that bar so that we can not only increase the nutrition, hopefully we'll have a little bit more fun while we're doing it. Something I like to call Gakwa Unwe. It's a little bit of a term I coined in Guelph Geha. So we have Unwe Hunwe, which would just be people, referring to real people. So the word that we use in Guelph Geha or any of the Haudenosaunee language was referring to people or human beings, real people. And then we have Gakwa, meaning food. We could say Gakwio, which would mean it was good food. Gakwa Sum'a, pluralizing foods. But if we say Gakwa Unwe, we add that realness and that originality to food. So I like to use this concept because Gakwa Unwe, for me then, helps me to live a really happy life by eating things like avocados and cacao, things that didn't originate in Haudenosaunee territory, but are still Gakwa Unwe. Because I think that food is a universalizer. Food is one way, not only that it brings us together, but sometimes the content on that plate will bring us together as well. And anybody, and I know I've heard some people use this term settler. I guess if you want to use it, that's okay, but to me, we're all here right now, and regardless of your origin and at which generation your family may have come here, we're here now. We got to learn how to get along now. We're family right now. And we can talk about these things and we can have those sticky conversations, but when we do it in that context of family and do it in the context of making each other feel welcome. There's one thing I know that people of all cultures all over the world, one thing they like to talk about right away is the foods that they had, whether it was growing up or the foods that they like to make or the foods that their grandmother made, their soul foods from anywhere that we are on the planet, right? So Gakwa Unwe to me is this a concept. It's food in its original state, food that comes from Yetimi Stoha Jiohanjade, going right back to the first woman who was placed in the ground. She to us is our mother the earth. All foods originate from her. And it reminds us of what food is. We know food is this thing that every human being needs. It's something that we have in common. So if you look at that, our mother who sustains us, and the foods that come from her that sustain us, that's another thing that we all immediately have in common. Every single one of us, no matter where we came from. So it's one of the things I love about food. It's that universalizer. It helps us break down some of the barriers when we have the conversation. And like I said, I mentioned cacao and avocados because I believe as part of Haudenosaunee history, we were told that when the first original 5 nations, when they were first united, the 4 white roots of peace underneath the tree of peace that was planted were meant to extend out as far as they could go across the planet. And anyone or any nation who wanted to seek shelter underneath the leaves of that tree or underneath the jurisdiction of the Haudenosaunee was free to do so. So I believe that really this sort of multinational United Nations kind of policy was really originally a Haudenosaunee thing. Just unfortunately some of the founding fathers over there across the border didn't quite get it right. And unfortunately some of their relatives who kind of found their way on this side of the border perhaps didn't get it right in the beginning either, but we're working on it, right? We're working on it together. So that notion of multiculturalism. The Haudenosaunee were 5 original nations and then added in Rick's nation of the Tuscarora to make the 6 nations. That was the original United Nations. So that was people of different cultures coming together. And if you spend a lot of time in Haudenosaunee territory, you'll know the difference between a Mohawk and Oneida. You know the difference between the Tuscaroras and, well, just about anybody. So you'll get to see this notion of multiculturalism even just amongst the Haudenosaunee. Similarly, I mention this because people often ask this question. In fact, I was asked a question on the weekend at a conference that I spoke at. Do Native Americans eat insects? And so one of the ways that I chose to respond to that question was, well, really anybody on the planet, depending on the landscape where you find yourself, that's going to inform the foods that you have, or the foods that you had. Just like I said, well, you know, the French and the Russians, like, you're all the same, right? And so then and she kind of thought, oh yeah, I hadn't really thought about it that way. So of course there are similarities amongst all people, and there are similarities amongst all Ongwe or native people here. But if you come up and ask me a question about the Anishinaabe or the Dene, I may not know the answer. I've dedicated my life just to learning what little bit I know just about where I am now in the landscape I am amongst the Haudenosaunee. So just think about it that way. And really, if you look on the map, Europe is really only a fraction of the size of North America, right? So when you look at the vastness of the landscape and the territory, there's going to be a lot of differences going on amongst the cultures. Recently, several months ago, a good friend of ours asked me to do a small catering job. He's a lawyer working on a big land claim for the Thessalon First Nation up north. And even though I've got my children, and sometimes it's hard for me to do those types of jobs, I certainly didn't want to turn this one down because I knew it was a big one. He's been working on this land claim for a really, really long time. And so I cooked them a really great meal. And remember, probably many of you in this room, if you work with food, whether you're a mom and a homemaker or you're a dad and homemaker, you know that food is this really special substance. And if you know something like the creation story or your version of the creation story, and you know the origin of food, you know that it takes a whole lot of spiritual forces combined with you as a human and your human forces to end up with some cooked food on your plate. So I think about those things when I'm cooking, and I knew this was going to be a big job. So I put all my heart into it, and I cooked this meal for them, and I had to drop it off and run my kids somewhere. And later on, he said to me, he says, you know, Chandra, I've been working on this land claim for almost 20 years. He said, after lunch that day, he said, we made more progress that day than we've made in the last 20 years. I said, of course you did, it was the food. and he said, you're right, because it's the law. So I think that it's natural law, and we have something in Haudenosaunee history that at the time that the peacemaker, a prophet known as the peacemaker, first brought these original 5 nations together under something called the Guyana Goa, something known as the Great Law. And one of the things that came out of that was the importance of feeding leaders really well. And certainly, that honor was bestowed upon the women. Chiefs, we know, traditionally are men in Haudenosaunee communities, but we also know that it's the women who appoint those chiefs to be those leaders. So there's that built-in balance there. But also, women have that really important role and responsibility of feeding the chiefs, because those are the people that you've appointed to make good-minded decisions on your behalf, for you and your family. And if you're a woman, and today, you know, now we're in these nuclear houses, but you are the head of your family, and you are the head of the household, usually the women. And so when you send your men out there, you want to feed them well because you want them to make good-minded decisions on behalf of your family. So that's a really important role. And so when my friend said to me, yes, it's the law, I knew exactly what he meant. I understood that. Because when you feed people really well here, and you feed them really well in here, so you feed their bellies well and you feed their hearts well, that will make their minds well. That's skana sa nindanya. When I said, Ayamash diagwego skana sa nindanya, I hope that you're all well and peaceful in your minds. That starts here. In science, native science has known this for a long time, but the medical community, what I sometimes call the mainstream alternative community, is finally just starting to understand and make those links, right, between the gut and the brain. So the talk I gave last weekend at a conference in Buffalo is where I started talking about some new research that I've been doing, and I called it global colonization and how that is mirrored and reflected in our own gut microbiome. So starting to make all of these connections as we see the outward global devastation, environmental devastation, deforestation. Any of you know anything about your gut, right? You eat some fermented foods, take some probiotics, so why do we do that? Because our gut microbiome has also been colonized and then been deforested. So see those links. About 20 years ago or so, when I was really starting to learn how to cook myself and play with food and asking these questions around food, like fry bread, that doesn't look too traditional to me, but I would see it everywhere. Ubiquitous native food. pretty much in any community that you go in. So I started asking these questions. And it was around that same time when I actually learned how to make that cornbread that some of you were sampled today. And in a minute I'm going to explain a little bit about that process, because I think it really exemplifies something about being a human being really connected to food and connected to the spirituality of food. But as my master's project a long time ago, I initiated a community garden on the west side of Buffalo at the Native Center where I worked as a teenager. And at the time I didn't really think too much of it. I never really was much of a gardener, and quite frankly I'm still not. My husband does more of the gardening, but I do the harvesting and the cooking and the preparing and the loving and the feeding and all those other things. But food is a spectrum, right? Food isn't just food, food is a whole lot of things that go along with it. So if you're not the person who puts a seed in the ground, that's okay. So I did this community garden, and like I said, that was about 20 years ago. And I really didn't think then that it was that big of a deal, until I was speaking at a conference recently and somebody said to me, "You did a community garden back in the 90s? Wow, like nobody was doing that then." And I really haven't done much with it since, other than our own personal garden at home. But that's going to lead me into one of the things that I have done in the last 10 years, which was gather some people around